Hello, and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Rania Batrice, a non-resident fellow at FMEP. Today is Tuesday, August 27th, and I'm delighted to be here with Matt Duss. Matt is the Executive Vice President of the Center for International Policy, the co-host of Undiplomatic Podcasts, and the former FMEP president. So excited to have you back with us.
Very glad to
Also
be here.
former policy advisor, yes, former policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders. He has just a breadth of experience that covers a number of issue areas. And today I'm very eager to talk to you, Matt, about obviously Palestine and Israel and what's happening currently. So thank you so much for joining.
No, very glad to do this. Really love the podcast and love everything FMEP's been doing and the with the team over there. So it's a great privilege to be here.
Thank you. So we're just going to jump right in, and I want to start by hearing a little bit from you about how your personal experience and professional background have shaped your views on U.S. foreign policy in general, and then obviously more specifically as it relates to Arab nations.
Sure. I mean, my own, let's see, I mean, going way back personally, I mean, there's two things. One is, I mean, I grew up in the evangelical church. So coming from that background, like growing up with Sunday school and the Bible and the Old Testament and the New. And I was always just kind of curious about this place where all these events happened. I was a pretty studious, at least in terms of things I was interested in, not necessarily in school. But the Bible is just something that kind of fascinated me. But I became interested in, okay, how did we get from these old stories to what is happening now in the kind of modern world? And the second thing is growing up, my dad was a refugee from Ukraine. His family are Ukrainian immigrants. So that piece of it, kind of growing up in the 80s amid the Cold War and knowing that history of that part of my family always kind of gave me a kind of general interest, I think, in international affairs. So that was something that was very present in our house. These issues were discussed a lot. My dad was a journalist when I was young, so he was, not really working on foreign policy. He worked on a number of different issues. But all that to say, like, it was a pretty politically aware household in terms of current events. And so that's kind of what kind of made me initially interested. And now, as regards the Middle East, one thing that was really important is that one of my closest friends in high school was an Iraqi American. And I was very close with him, very close with his family, and to kind of be with them, like literally physically. I remember when the U.S. when the Gulf War started, um, when the U.S. the U.S. kind of invaded Iraq the first time in early 1991, like going to his house and sitting with his family and just kind of being with them, and that made a real impact on me, just to see how they were experiencing that whole thing. And I wasn't formally involved in kind of Middle East policy or foreign affairs until much later, but I think these are just some of the things that kind of prepped me for when I sort of made my move into that. Initially, when I went to college, I was focused on creative writing, like fiction and poetry and songwriting and stuff like that, and then made a move into policy once when I belatedly went back to finish undergrad, in my early 30s. I took a long time to finish my BA. Let's say I was on the 12-year plan.
Listen,
But
but it got you here, so you did
yeah,
something right.
no,
Yeah,
apparently,
absolutely.
it was a circuitous
Yeah.
path, so that was my experience. And then I'd say last thing I'll mention that really kind of like made me decide that I need to kind of focus on this region in a more formal way was going to Istanbul for the first time in the summer of 2000 for 2 weeks, and just was absolutely blown away by that city, and I still am. It's been some years since I've been back, but I've been able to go back a few times. I took my family there. We all went there for vacation about 10 years ago and had a great time. But just like just trying to understand what that city is about, like literally the crossroads of Europe and the Middle East, of Islam and Christianity and the old Roman Empire. There's so much going on there, and not just the history, but also like the basic principle of like the way these different cultures and societies and faiths kind of interact and collaborate. And it's not always a clash. Of course, clashes and violence are a part of history, every part of the world, but there's also so much about that city that is about the engagement between different cultures and different faiths, that I think is really inspiring if we want to look at it that way. And that's something that has kind of stayed with me and I try to bring to my work.
Yeah, and you and I spoke on back-to-back panels while we were in Chicago, and we're going to get into
Mhm.
the convention stuff in a second. But just hearing you say that really makes me think of, it's such an obvious thing, but the personal connections when we can humanize each other
Mhm.
because of those personal experiences, I just think that's so important and interesting and somehow completely lost. And I told the story on the panel I spoke on after yours in Chicago that, I remember my grandmother telling me stories about that side of my family is Catholic actually, but talking about her Jewish and Muslim neighbors
Mhm.
and how they breastfed each other's children. I
Mhm.
mean, they were that close. It was a true
Yeah.
community. And so, just hearing you talk about those kinds of personal experiences
Yeah.
really takes me to that place of, my God, if we could just start from there,
Yeah.
from a place of
Right.
humanity, how interesting that would be.
Yeah.
I'm going to pivot us to sometimes where there's no humanity, and that is the Hill.
Yeah.
Anyone who's spent time on the Hill, I think, knows what I'm talking about. But for anybody who, there's a lot of sort of talk, we see things on the news and other places about, what does or doesn't happen and the frustrations and the do nothing Congress and all the things. I would just love for you to talk a little bit about your time on the Hill and some of the challenges
Yeah.
you encountered there, in general or day to day, and just how the functionality of it.
Yeah, I mean, well, first off, my experience is, I just got to say, I don't think it's very typical. I mean, I had the great fortune of working, first of all, for a boss, Senator Sanders, with whom I agreed on like 99%. Um, and the other 1% I'm probably just wrong about. But also someone who was, I went in at a fairly senior level. They brought me on as his first foreign policy advisor. He had never had a full-time foreign policy advisor, and was able to establish a really good relationship with him, um, very early on. I remember the moment it hit me, of what he really wanted to do when we were talking through kind of the first big foreign policy speech that he was going to give after I joined his team. And it just really hit me, as we were kind of working through these things, that I was actually being too conservative. And like this is something he would kind of jokingly accuse me of from time to time, and which is pretty wild for people who know me. I'm sure, but it just that feeling of like, wow, he really wants to give the speech I've been really waiting to write for a very long time. Um, and to be able to work with someone with that amount of courage and that amount of vision, who had, when I joined his team at the beginning of 2017, after 2016, he obviously had a much bigger platform, a much bigger voice, and enormous pull, inside the party, inside the Congress. So, you know, being as his kind of lead foreign policy staffer, I had the opportunity to kind of represent his views in a lot of these meetings with other leadership staff. And I'll say, as weird and kind of messed up as the Congress is, and let's be clear, Congress in general is just completely dysfunctional, even compared to past Congresses. And the Senate in particular is designed to be dysfunctional, I think, as we all know. I mean, the Senate was created to essentially frustrate democracy or constrain it. In a lot of ways, our entire political system was designed to constrain rather than facilitate democracy. But I think the Senate is one of the purest expressions of that. But still, each of 100 senators do have a pretty strong amount of influence. Like, for example, any senator can kind of gum up the works by refusing consent on bills, on nominations. Um, but having said that, I'll also say I was surprised at how encouraged I came away from the Senate in terms of just staff work. I mean, the Senate is full of a lot of, and the House, I'll say, just full of a lot of really great, smart, committed, um, people, mostly young people, but not only, who are working long hours for far too little money, um, to really advance, not only, to their boss's agenda, because that's the responsibility of every staffer, is to kind of advance their boss's work, not their own, but also the level of interaction that took place between staffers, sharing information, not just within the party, but also between parties, like still having a number of very good relationships with Republican staffers who, even if we don't agree on a lot, just agreed that we would all benefit from being straight and open with each other about what our boss's goals were. Um, so I would just say my concerns and frustrations with the direction of foreign policy remains, and is in fact probably deeper, but I do think I have a better understanding of why those things are as they are and what we need to do to kind of shift them.
Kind of makes you the perfect person to be talking to, as always. I want to talk a little bit about shift in policy, which I will say it is really hard to sort of feel a
Yeah.
shift, especially when, like on the top of the ticket on the GOP side, they're literally using, they being former President
Yeah.
Trump, is using Palestinian as a slur.
Yeah.
Um, and the only person that I've actually heard push back on that is former State Department staffer Josh Paul.
Mhm.
So, with that as the background, with genocide as the background, like all
Mhm.
these things, I do want to talk a little bit about what you're seeing and how you feel, starting with the Republican
Yeah.
side. Any movement, any evolution when it comes to Palestine and
Yeah.
Israel, on that side of things.
Yeah. I mean, on the Republican side, I am sorry to say I don't have good news. I mean, you can find people who will privately express concern, but as I think is pretty clear, the Republican Party at this point is essentially a cult controlled by a fanatical religious leader named Donald Trump. Which is wild and troubling, and obviously the consequences we have already seen, and could be potentially far worse. Um, I think we don't have to get into the long reasons for that here, but I will say just briefly, I think there is some responsibility, not just of the Republican Party, but of Democrats as well, of the kind of foreign policy establishment. And there have been a number of pieces and books written about this, including by my good friend Spencer Ackerman, whose book Reign of Terror, about the war on terror, is really, really excellent, but really goes into some of the ways in which the kind of discourse around the war on terror post 9/11, the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, really kind of laid the groundwork for a deeply bigoted, xenophobic, racist politics. Um, and this is not just on the extremes. I mean, this is the way that very mainstream members of Congress and other leaders were talking about foreign policy. We're talking about the Middle East. We're talking about, this idea that we need to invade that region and civilize these people at the point of our guns. Um, this really prepped, you know, parts of the country for someone like Trump. I mean, there were a lot of other factors. I don't want to oversimplify it, but I do think the way we've talked about foreign policy and continue to talk about it, when you see people like, Lindsey Graham coming out and talking about like flattening the place. I mean, we can go through a whole list of like absolutely offensive, deeply stupid and
Yeah.
ignorant comments about Palestine in particular, but the region in general, that we continue to tolerate, or at least not call out at all. Um,
Hmm.
this is what produces a demagogue like Donald Trump.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I often talk about just the decades of dehumanization,
Mhm.
very
Yeah,
intentional, that has been put forward for so long with um, no pushback
exactly.
really,
Yeah, no
and
consequence.
so
Yeah.
yeah, no consequences. And if you did, I mean, we still see it today, frankly. I think we live in a time of smartphones and all of the
Mhm.
things, so it's a little different now, but we're still seeing the same type of
Yeah.
rhetoric oftentimes. And so I do want to move into the, talking about sort of what we're seeing from the Democrats. And obviously there's been a shift in rhetoric, which is
Mhm.
welcome, just post the vice president's meeting
Yeah.
with Netanyahu, even the
Yeah.
statement from Phil Gordon,
Mhm.
and even kind of the commitment to international humanitarian law, which is not something I don't think that we've necessarily seen from more of the establishment wing of the
Mhm.
party.
Yeah.
And then obviously the convention speak language, which I have a lot of thoughts and feelings on, but even some of what was included there, and I want to be really clear, I'm not okay with
Mhm.
all of it, but even
Yeah.
that there's still a shift in rhetoric that we've seen. It's of course welcome, but again, not enough. We're coming off convention, just
Yeah.
ended on Thursday in Chicago, where you and I both were.
Yeah.
So that might kind of serve as a little bit of a hint, but we're reading between the lines. You and I have actually, I think, talked about this a little bit before. Um, what's been said, what's to come, but in so many ways, this is so much a part of your world. I would love your sense of things coming out of convention and beyond.
Yeah. Well, first, I want to just say that, I came to Washington in early 2007, um, and have worked on, U.S. Middle East policy issues since then. And I know it can feel frustrating, but I just have to say, like, the debate and the discourse around these issues has changed so dramatically. And I know that sometimes it doesn't feel that way. But, and that's a tribute to the work of so many people, including FMEP, including a lot of our friends and allies who've been doing this work certainly before I have. Um, and, in various ways, both in formal kind of in policy in terms of the Hill and elsewhere, and in communities around the country. Um, so yeah, in terms of what we saw at the DNC, as others have noted, there was a panel on Palestinian rights that was not part of the kind of prime time, but it was on, the sidelines in the DNC. Um, and then there was a lot of people pushing and including me behind the scenes trying to get some language, you know, in the vice president's speech. A lot of people working on this. Obviously, they wanted to get a Palestinian speaker up there, which I think was an entirely legitimate request. I think it was a mistake for them not to do that, especially given what we've been seeing in Gaza. I mean, this catastrophe now, I think in its 11th month. Um, but while I agree, that the vice president, I would have liked to hear more from her. I just want to step back and like the fact that let's just go back to 2016, right? You had the 2016 debate between Bernie and Hillary Clinton in Brooklyn. And I remember this well, I'm sure you do too, where he raised the issue of Palestinian rights and got this huge round of applause. And that was
Yeah,
seen as a moment, a real moment. Um, and this year, 2024, we had, the nominee for president of the Democratic Party say something very similar from the podium in her acceptance speech.
yeah,
So while I agree with those who feel like we could have heard a bit more, I feel like we need to recognize that this is where we are now. It's not just something that she would say on the trail at some point. She said this in her acceptance speech at the convention. And when you look at the way that that speech was arranged, it was fairly short, um, but it also was a kind of like the sense was what is the minimum I need to say to address not only my vision but certain constituencies within the party, given that she is now the leader of the Democratic Party. And I think the fact that one of those boxes she felt she needed to check was Palestinian rights, even if some of us felt she could have been a bit more explicit and detailed about that, I do think that is worth acknowledging, and
sure.
appreciating. So again, I
Yeah.
would hope to hear a bit more from her as we go on, but I think we should recognize that as a victory.
Yeah, and I don't disagree. I think it just, and for anybody who's watching who didn't watch her speech, I do encourage folks to go find it, but the reality is, and I think my frustration within my community and allies and things like that is that the language continues to be very active when just
Mhm.
talking about
Yes,
the
totally
suffering
agree.
Israeli people, and very passive
Yes.
when it comes to
Right.
suffering of
Right.
Palestinian
Right. What has
people.
happened in Gaza as if it's the weather, right.
Exactly. That's exactly. It's
Right.
like it was a natural disaster. It was a
Yes. Right.
hurricane, not
Right.
and not a very
Yes.
intentional,
A military that is
force-implemented.
armed by us and defended and enabled and
Ex-
subsidized by us. Yes.
exactly. But to your point, I do think, like you said, it's important that we do acknowledge the shift. And
Yeah.
and even a year ago, we would not have heard that from any nominee, I feel like, aside from Bernie. But if it was Bernie, um, but much less from that stage
Yeah.
specifically. So, I feel like a lot of people are in a lot of different places. For me, I personally feel like my job here is to pull whatever levers I have
Mhm.
within the vice president's orbit and team. I know you do the same thing as well, and so it's always this conversation about inside outside
Mhm.
strategy. um so yeah, I do appreciate you naming that.
Mhm.
So I do want to kind of move into just our our in the US, our long-standing history of very much unquestionable allegiance to the state of Israel, regardless of human rights abuses. Of course, like I
Yeah.
said, we're watching it everybody has a smartphone, everybody's
Yeah.
watching it on their phones every day, but it's not new. This is not, none of these things are new. The UN has reported on even like sexual assault among the IDF and detainees. Um, and the United States, excuse me, has stood by and not really only excused these abuses, but helped to fund their execution. And has continued in the Biden administration.
Mhm.
We've heard a lot of very troubling things out of President Biden's mouth, and all the things from early on, questioning the death toll numbers, which we know are likely much higher than what's being reported. Repeating propaganda that
Yeah.
actually has been debunked. All
Yeah.
of those kinds of
Yeah.
things directly out of the president's mouth. Um, from somebody who, his campaign in 2020 was really had a theme of empathy and
Yeah.
compassion. And yet we're in this place
Yeah.
where, again, we're feeling like our own president. I'm Palestinian American, and I feel like he's dehumanizing me and my family and
Yeah.
all of us. Not to mention the continued funding, excuse me, the facilitation. And this is what's happening in Gaza, and also what's happening in the West Bank
Yeah.
is really atrocious too. So I just,
Yeah.
I'd love to just kind of hear your thoughts on, like, how do we square that circle? How do we move forward from this?
Yeah. I don't think there's any way to square that circle, at least in terms of Biden. I think this policy, and I've said this, I will continue to say it, it's been a disgrace. It's been a catastrophe. His own language has shown repeatedly, I'm very sorry to say this, that he simply does not hold Palestinian lives as equal in value to Israeli
Yeah,
lives. Um, and again, I don't say that lightly, but I
of
think both
course.
in
Yeah,
terms of his own rhetoric and in terms of this policy, that is very, very clear. And I think that's, again, not only disgraceful ethically and morally, I think strategically it's a disaster. I don't think this administration understands yet how we're going to be kind of picking up the pieces and dealing with the
yeah,
consequences of this for a generation.
yeah,
Because, this conversation, as even though it has shifted, it still takes place in this kind of weird Washington bubble. Um, I mean, I know that you all at FMEP know we all struggle against, why that is. We face a
mhm,
very well resourced kind of industry of propaganda,
mhm,
one of whose goals is to kind of obscure the reality in Israel Palestine and to obscure the reality of violence that Palestinians endure every day, even before this war, even before October 7. And that's been one of my real issues is the way we talk about this as if history began on October 7. Of course, it did not.
yeah, yeah,
And again, one doesn't have to defend October 7. No one should ever do that. But we do need to understand a context of decades of daily violence to understand where something like that comes from. And Biden is of an approach and a mindset and a worldview that simply does not seem to understand that. Um,
yeah,
and this is true in general of foreign policy. I mean, I think you can find, and I have, I recognize there are certain things Biden has done in foreign policy that I think are very good. It's kind of a mixed bag. Um, but the Middle East in particular is a region where he just seems stuck in a completely outdated understanding. Um, that's a lot of people of his generation share this, view. It's the kind of post 1967 war view of Israel as this plucky little democracy surrounded by a sea of enemies that was, may have been kind of true at one point, is certainly no longer true. I mean, Israel is now a regional military superpower. That's not to say it doesn't face challenges externally and internally. Um, but this idea that Israel is somehow besieged by threatening enemies all around, and it would disappear with
Yeah.
our support, and that it's a democracy, I think is just
Right. Let's
not
start with
tenable.
that.
Let's start
Exactly.
exactly. Let's start with
Yeah.
that. So
Yeah.
again, that's just not to say that
Yeah.
I would, urge President Biden to come out tomorrow and withdraw all support from Israel, but I do think it's very reasonable to ask that the President of the United States at least speak honestly, um, about
Hmm.
the situation. And I really, it bothers me that he has not done that, and his spokespeople have not done that. It's not just a Biden problem. Kirby is
Yeah.
very much a part of this problem.
Yeah.
Miller at State is very much a part of this problem. It's just this rhetoric that seems to
Yeah.
exist in this weird through the looking glass world, uh, where, and I have made this comparison too, many other
Yeah.
people have. They can speak very explicitly and truthfully about what Russia's doing in Ukraine. And again,
Yeah.
I appreciate this as a
Yeah.
Ukrainian American. I really
Of
appreciate that our
course.
government speaks truthfully about the atrocities we witness by
Hmm.
Russian military against Ukrainian civilians. But when the Israeli military does those exact same things in terms of cutting off water, electricity, power, um, blowing up hospitals, blowing up civilian centers, all of a sudden it's like, well, we
Hmm.
hope they'll investigate that. We hope that they'll be, I mean, it's just,
Right.
no, it's just complete gaslighting.
Ooh, it is. And I often bring up I'm sure you've seen somebody cut together the side by side video,
Yeah,
speaking of Kirby,
right.
where he's talking about dead Ukrainian
Yeah,
children and
tearing
is
up, all
beside
those.
himself
Yes,
in
right,
tears.
right,
And then when talking about dead
right.
Palestinian children, just like shrug shoulders, that's the
Yeah,
cost of war. I mean,
right.
like,
No, it's
and
so
I've
gross.
said, you cannot tell me that that's about anything
Yeah,
aside from
yeah,
racism.
right.
I mean, all the propaganda, of course, we know, decades, all these things, but we're talking about
Yeah,
it's atrocious no matter what, but dead
right,
white children versus
right.
dead brown children. And
Yeah,
somehow, we can't find our humanity just
right,
in agreeing that children should be off limits. Like, can
right.
we start there,
And so, yeah, I think part of the project is can we build, a foreign policy approach that genuinely recognizes the humanity of all these people and the human costs, but also that's committed to a genuinely rules-based order, because we've heard
Yeah.
this rhetoric so much, especially in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. But I think, what we've seen since October 7 is like, you could not imagine, you could not script a better experiment where they just dynamited that entire
Yeah.
argument in the eyes of the world and in the
Yeah.
eyes of many Americans. Like, everything you've just spent the past year and a half telling us about the
Hmm.
rules-based order is a bunch of
Yeah.
nonsense.
Yep. It's selective
Yeah,
at best.
right. Which is to
And
say
I
it's
think that
meaningless.
actually
Yeah.
right. And this is sort of not, I don't want to lead you anywhere in particular, but it does sort of lead me to my next question for
Mhm.
you, which is, if you and I were just to dream together for a
Mhm.
moment here, and you could snap your fingers and make a single change right now, right this moment, that would lend itself toward, broader changes toward peace, security, collective liberation, all of
Yeah.
those things. What would that be if we're dreaming together?
Enforce the law. The president should
Yes.
enforce the law. All right. This is not some kind of special consequence or sanction that we are imposing on one country. Our laws, multiple laws, govern prohibit the provision of military aid, weapons, ammunition, the whole lot, to militaries that are violating human rights. We have countless examples of evidence by multiple human rights organizations that this has been ongoing in a systemic fashion in Gaza, even before October 7th, but especially in this war. We have the confessions of Israeli political leaders that this has happened. We have videos of Israeli troops. And I don't know, their obsession with putting on Palestinian women's clothes. I guess there are going to be multiple
Weird,
dissertations
right?
written about this,
Yeah.
but just
Yeah.
enforce the law and the kind of the various ways they've sought to avoid doing this is really should be very concerning. So
Yeah.
that would be the first step.
Yeah.
Just uphold the law, have the courage to recognize what
Yeah.
everyone else can see, but also recognize in terms of our interests, in terms of American credibility, everyone else around the world and in the United States can see that this is going on. And so when Kirby and these other spokespeople get up there and they say, well, we just haven't seen evidence, it's completely corrosive, not just to our foreign
Yeah.
policy, but to our democracy. And I
Yeah.
really think this is
Absolutely.
important.
Yeah, it's embarrassing,
It's
it's
embarrassing, but it's
and
also, let's
yeah.
understand, like, authoritarianism thrives on this idea that you can't believe anything, you can't trust anyone, you certainly can't trust the government.
Yeah.
And that's a key
Hmm.
point, is authoritarians don't say just believe me. Authoritarians say believe nothing.
Yeah.
And then I will give you something that makes you feel good and you can believe that. You know, just and this is part of what really bothers me. I actually think that the Biden administration did some really important work around the Russian invasion of Ukraine with, the strategic release of intelligence, and especially, coming after the Iraq War, where the credibility of the United States was utterly destroyed. For the world to see the United States saying, this is what we think is going to happen. We believe Russia is preparing to invade Ukraine. And you had all these kinds of voices around the world, even some of our partners and allies. Even Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, was like, nah, it's not going to happen. They'd never do that. And then they did.
Yeah.
So, people saw, okay, the United States is not just screwing around here. This is not just some kind of strategic disinformation campaign. I'm not saying that fixed the problem. I'm just saying that that was an important moment to kind of starting to reestablish some measure of trust and credibility for the voice of the United States. And that's just been utterly demolished over these past 10 months. And the work of kind of rebuilding that is going to be so long and so hard.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would just think you bring up such an important point about the corrosive nature of operating in this way.
Mhm.
Wildly inconsistent, not following our
Yeah,
own laws, not to
yeah,
mention international law,
yeah,
international
yeah,
humanitarian law, downplaying, if we're being nice about it, the ICC and the
yeah,
ICJ, all of these
right,
things are just the word corrosive, I think, is the perfect
yeah,
word that you used. So just to close this out, because everybody's always looking for something.
mm,
Um, what should people be doing right now to impact and influence those that are creating and implementing these laws? And I will name real quick. Yesterday, or maybe it was Sunday, we even heard Elizabeth Warren say
mhm,
exactly what you said, which
right,
honestly I was a little surprised by,
yeah,
not because of anything except for that's just not where she usually
mm,
exists.
yeah,
But she said we need to be following our own laws. So
yeah. Which
we're
shouldn't be a
seeing some of
crazy
the
thing
shifts.
to
So
hear from a U.S. senator.
no,
It really
no,
shouldn't.
truly, truly.
Yeah,
But understanding that this
yeah,
isn't something that's sort of norm. So what can
yeah,
people do to help impact and influence
yeah,
the shift that we're all sort of looking for,
yeah.
especially as it relates to Palestine and Israel?
Yeah, I really think pressing on that. Um, we're in a campaign now, and again, I hope everyone understands the stakes and the choice that we will face. Um, but I also think there's an opportunity now on the trail. Saying what I said before about I recognize the significance of what the vice president said in her acceptance speech, but I do think, and I hope there will be an opportunity for her to talk in a bit more detail about what she's going to do. I think we heard from her chief foreign policy advisor, Phil Gordon, a few weeks ago. She's not going to call for an embargo. Honestly, I don't think anyone should expect her to say the word embargo. I do think it's quite reasonable to expect her to just stress how she will follow the law. Um, Again, as with a U.S. senator, it should not be a strange commitment to expect from a president of the United States. Um, and I really think that's a key approach, because it's not that we want to impose a double standard on Israel. We want to end a double standard, um,
Yeah,
with regard
yeah,
to Israel and with regard to a number of other countries who we tend to continue just funnel arms at, empowering really, problematic governments
Yeah.
in that region and elsewhere. So I think there's a much larger question here about how America behaves in the world, our foreign policy, but obviously with Gaza being very much in the news for obvious reasons, I think this is a place to focus and just to continue to show that, I mean, these are not folks who are trying to tear down Harris or try to tear down the party. This is, the uncommitted movement, just to mention them. These are folks who understand the stakes. And this is part of what I really, really admire about the work they've been doing is they're working within the party and making the very credible and legitimate argument is like we represent a very strong and growing constituency in this party. And we have a very reasonable ask that's going to mean a lot to our communities. And what can you tell us that we can turn around and tell to them?
Absolutely. And I will just point out too that the uncommitted movement is made up of not just Palestinians, not just Arabs, not just
Right,
Muslims. It's made up of a
right,
rainbow of allies
right,
who care deeply about this. And for a lot of people, they see themselves,
right,
whether it's historic or even,
right.
present policy. So I think that's a very important thing to name. And I will just name one more thing to keep us all not in trouble. Foundation for Middle East Peace, of course, is a 501c3. So we're talking very analytically here, and the foundation doesn't endorse candidates or anything like that. So just going to say that as we wrap up our conversation. And
Yep.
of course, Matt, I just appreciate you so much. Always appreciate your perspective in our conversations. And thanks for spending time with us
And
today.
me too, Rania. Thank you for your work, and it's great to join you for this.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody who is tuning in to this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website. That's www.fmep.org for resources related to this podcast and lots of other great content that's related to Palestine and Israel as we continue this conversation. Please make sure to subscribe to this podcast to stay up to date. And you can also find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. You can also watch the video version of this podcast, including this one, on YouTube. And with that, I'm Rania Batrice signing off of this until the next episode of Occupied Thoughts.